Today's daf is daf mem hey, and we start with the Mishnah, which is 5 lines down from the top of the Yomim. Koche ovdei kol chavim. The subject of today's daf is the carbon that's brought by a goy. And sometimes I think that the Mishnah uses the word ovdei kol chavim to avoid censorship problems, to be politically correct. But be that as it may, a carbon can be brought by a goy. It's not exactly clear which kind of carbonos a guy could bring. Everybody seems to agree that he can voluntarily bring a carbon ola, but there is somewhat of a debate about a carbon shlomim. But after all the debate, I think when the dust settles down, the premise is that he can bring even a carbon shlomim. But the carbon that the guy brings has its own set of halachos, and I think we could summarize in one sentence that there are a lot of kulos with regard to a carbon of a guy. Now, the source for the fact that a guy could bring a carbon is actually a pasuk in Vayikach of Beis, Ish asher yakriv carbon. And the double language ish is coming to add a guy, that a guy can bring a carbon as well. But ein chayovin aleh mishum pigul nosar v'tameh. So the Torah was more machmir with regard to the kodshim, the carbon of a Jew, in 3 different ways. That if there was a machshavas pigul with all the conditions that we've discussed, then the basar becomes asur with an isur kares, and if the carbon was left beyond its allotted time, there's a severe violation of nosar if one eats the basar, the carbon, and tameh, which would mean that a tameh is not allowed to come in contact with the basar. And these halachos don't apply to the kodshim, the carbon that's brought by a guy. So if, for example, the carbon that was brought by a guy, the Kohen, when he did the avodah in the Mikdash, he had in mind nosar, pigul, or if he left over the meat beyond its time, it became nosar, or a tummy came along and ate it. In all these cases, there's no liability with the usual penalty or punishment of kares. However, although there is no kares, then if, let's say, the meat itself became tameh, not the case that we discussed before where he is tameh and he ate the meat, then even in a case of a carbon of a Jew, if it became tameh and he eats it, let's say he would be chayiv malchus, but in this case, there's no chayiv malchus. But again, we have to emphasize that in pigul, nosar, and tameh, the carbon becomes possible, even though it's a carbon of a guy. The only leniency is if somebody went ahead and he ate pigul, nosar, or tameh of a carbon of a guy. The Mishnah continues, Vashochton bachutz potter. Normally, if you have a carbon of a Jew and it was shechted outside of the Beis Hamikdash, outside of the Azorah, then you chayav kares for that. But in the case of a carbon shel goy, there's no chiyuv kares. All this is recorded in the name of Rabbi Shimon. The dissenting view, which is recorded here at the end of the Mishnah, is Rabbi Yossi, and he's mechayev. He holds that in the cases of pigul, nosar, vitame, or shchita bachutz of a carbon of a goy, you're chayev. And the regular chiyuvim that apply to a carbon of a Jew apply likewise to the carbon of a goy. Tana Rabbanan, the Gemara brings a brisa, kodshe ovdei kochavim, lo nenim v'lo mo'alim. What does this mean? This means that the status of the kodesh, of the carbon of a guy, is kind of in the middle. It's in a compromised situation. On the one hand, lo nenim, you're not allowed to derive benefit from the carbon. You can't ride the animal, to work that morning. But on the other hand, there's no violation of me'ilah. Now, the question is whether lo nenim is an iser drabanan or an iser d'oraisa. It would seem from a sugya later on, and also from a sugya that we learned earlier on Daf Mem Dalid, that the iser of hanav, deriving benefit from a carbon agoy, is only derabanan. Me'ila again is a doraisa haloch that requires a carbon asham me'ilos. You have to add it. None of that applies if a person was moel in the kodshim of the carbon of a goy. Now, here we have to mention an issue that's going to come up, and that is the carbon of a goy. Does it have at least the basic status of what's called kodshe berek habayis, or kedushas domim? And the nafkamina would be, is there me'ilah? The Mishnah itself says ein lo molim. So the language of lo molim sounds like, at the surface level, that even as far as kedushas domim is concerned, there's no status of kedushas domim, which is a little bit problematic because who's paying the bills over here for this carbon? The guy is paying the bills. If the guy is paying the bills, then he's really transferring ownership over to Hegdesh, and that should generate an Isa Me'ilah. So let's leave that on the side. Now the Brisa continues, V'ein chayovan alem mishum pigul nosav v'tami, that we saw in the Mishnah, V'ein osim tmura. So that if you have a carbon of a guy, and you have a behemas chulin, and you say this, you declare that this behemas chulin should be tmura, the behemas carbon of a guy, the tmura is not chal. The Gemara is going to have to derive this from psukim. And ein mevi'in nisachim. A guy cannot bring nisachim, meaning every carbon that a Jew brings has to be accompanied by niskei yayin. But in the case of a guy who brings a carbon, the carbon is not going to be accompanied by niskei yayin. Or do we say no? That maybe what the Mishnah means is ein mevi'in nisachim, meaning if it's a nisachim haboim b'fnei atzman, not to accompany a carbon, but rather if binidava, the guy says, I want to voluntarily bring niskei yayin, we don't accept that. That's not a valid nidava. But if you look at the Mishnah now, it says, Aval karbanam ta'un nisachim divrei Rabbi Shimon. So that if they bring a carbon, let's say ola, maybe even shlamim, according to that Mandi Omar, then the carbon is going to be accompanied by nisachim. But if they bring a voluntary niskei yayin on its own, not as an accompaniment to a carbon, then that donation or voluntary carbon, nesachim, libation, is not acceptable. That's all Rabbi Shimon. And now we get Rabbi Yossi. We remember from our Mishnah that Rabbi Yossi is machmir and basically equates a carbon of a guy to a carbon of a Jew. And therefore, Ro'a ani bekulan lahachmir. I have a pasuk from which I'm going to derive that all the chumras that apply to a carbon of a Jew apply likewise to a carbon of a guy. Shenemar bahen lashem. When the Torah says lashem in Vayikra Perek Chav Beis, and that was the pasuk of ish that we quoted earlier as the source for the derivation that an akum can bring a carbon. So it says in that pasuk, let's just read the pasuk inside for a minute. Daber el Aaron vel bona vel kol b'nei Yisrael teleim. Ish mi beis Yisrael u'min ager b'Yisrael asher yakriv karbano l'chol nidreim l'chol nidvosam asher yakrivu l'Hashem ola. So the words asher yakrivu l'Hashem, according to Rabbi Yossi, include a carbon of a guy. And that means that it is considered a carbon lashem. If it's a carbon lashem, that elevates it to the status of a regular carbon. For example, you'd be chayav for pigul nosar and tuma. You'd be subject to the laws of me'ilah, and you could create tmura. Now, Rashi points out here that as far as a voluntary niskeyayin, even according to Rabbi Yossi, there's no possibility of a guy voluntarily offering niskeyayin. So in effect, the words here, Amar Rabbi Yossi, really go back on an earlier part of the Mishnah. It doesn't go back on the last part of the Mishnah that says Ein Mevi'in Nisachim, meaning that they cannot voluntarily bring a nedava of Nisachim. Even Rabbi Yossi agrees to that. Rabbi Yossi says, Roa Niva Kulam Lahachmir, that's only referring to Pigul, Nosar, Tomei, Me'ilah, and Tmura. Now we go back to Reb Shimon. When do we say, according to Reb Shimon, that a carbon of a guy is the exception is excluded from Me'ilah? Bekadshim is beach. Aval bekadshim berek habayis mo'alim b'hem. In other words, the Gemara is assuming that when a guy brings a carbon, that carbon is kadshim is beach. And Reb Shimon says about kadshim is beach, there are no dinim of Me'ilah, there are no dinim of Isutuma and Pigul and Nosa. But if, on the other hand, the guy didn't bring a carbon, what he did was he promised a donation to the Beis Hamikdash, which is called Bedek Habayis. Bedek Habayis means Momon or Kinyan, Hegdesh, Momon Hegdesh B'Kinyono, and that's what generates an Isa Be'ilah. So if the Akum now brings a gift for a donation for the Bedek Habayis, then that would generate an Isa Me'ilah. And the assumption is that the Isa Me'ilah would be Da'oraisa. Lo nenim v'lo mo'alim. And we said before that in a carbon of a guy, there's no Me'ilah. So the Iser Hanoi here is only a rabbinic Iser, and that's what the Gemara clarifies now. Lo nenim midrabanan v'lo mo'alim. There's no Me'ilah. There's only an Iser Hanoi midrabanan. And that's going to be derived from a Gzeira Shava. The Gomar Me'ilah chet mitruma. So we have the word chet in the parsha of Truma, and we have the word chet. So in the parsha of Truma it says V'shamru es mishmarti v'lo yisu olav chet. So that's in Truma it says chet. And then, with regard to Me'ilah, it says, V'nefesh ki simol mal v'chata v'shkaga mikach Yeshem. So also the word chet. So now we have a Gzeira Shava that links Truma with Me'ilah. Oh, so how do we know that Me'ilah does not apply to a carbon of a guy? All right, we have a Gzeira Shava that takes Me'ilah and brings it to Truma, but who says that a guy is excluded? That's what it says, the Betruma Ksiv B'nai Yisrael. The Torah went out of its way in the case of Truma to emphasize B'nai Yisrael. V'lo yechalu es Kodshe B'nai Yisrael es asher yarimu Lashem. So it says Kodshe B'nai Yisrael with regard to Truma. V'lo Ovdei Kochavim. Now, again, it would be an interesting research project that sometimes, even though when it says B'nai Yisrael, we still include an akum, but the general rule is, in 99 out of 100 cases, that when it says B'nai Yisrael, it's coming to exclude akum. Then we have the Brisa, Ein Chayom Mishum Pigul Nosa V'Tamim Ma'itaymo. What's the source from which we derive that in the case of a carbon of a goy, there's no Pigul Nosar or Tameh? And the answer is we have another Gzeira Shava. The Asi Pigul Avon Minosar. That the word Avon appears in the Parsha of Pigul and also in the Parsha of Nosar. So that's going to link up Pigul and Nosar. This Torah says regarding Pigul, V'anefesh ocheles mimenu avona tisa, and with regard to Nosar, it says V'ochlov avono yisa. So we have avon, and now we have a linkage between Pigul and Nosar. I'm going to write this down because we don't have a whiteboard here, but because there are going to be a bunch of Gzeira Shavas here. So we have Gzeira Shava, Pigul, and Nosar. Okay, that didn't work here. Let's see if this will work. Okay. Now we have another Gzeira Shava. The Asi Nosar Mituma. How? Chilul. Right? So we have a pasuk that says, with regard to Tomei, if a Tomei eats from a carbon, lo yechalu Hashem kodshi. So the word chilul appears there. That's in the parsha of Tuma. And then in the parsha of Nosar, it says lo yechalu, etc. So that's called chilul, nosar mituma. So let's write that down. Nosar tuma. If a tome eats the basa kodesh. Now, so we have, if we go backwards, I'm just going to go backwards for a moment. We have tuma to nosar and nosar to pigul. So let's start with tuma. Ubetuma ksiv b'nei Yisrael. Right? We saw that the pasuk says in Vayikra of Beis with regard to Tuma, it talks about Bnei Yisrael. And Bnei Yisrael is the exclusion of Akum, V'lo of Kochavim. So now we take Tuma, where in Tuma it says Bnei Yisrael to exclude Akum, and now we have Gzeira Shava to Nosar. So therefore, a carbon of an Akum is excluded from the violation of the Isur Nosar. And then we have Nosar to Pigul. And therefore, we're going to piggyback one Gzeira Shava on top of the other and come to the conclusion that neither Pigul, Nosar, nor Tuma. Actually, I should do it the other way around. Let's start it this way. Tuma, Nosar, Pigul apply to the carbon of an Akum. Now the Brisa says V'einosin Tmura. My timer, what's the source for this din that there's no tmura in a carbon of a goy? The iskash tmura lemaser. Maser behema means every 10th animal in his herd he has to designate as maser and bring it as a carbon. So now we have a hekesh between tmura and maser. And this hekesh is based on, I think it's Vayikra of Zion, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see if I find it here. 1 second. Okay, I don't have it now, but I think it's Vayikra Chav Zayin, and there it speaks about Maser, and in Tmura it says V'chol Maser Bakar Vatzon Lo Yimirenu. So this gives us an equation between Maser and Tmura. Umaser Behema is Kishla Maser Dagon. Now we have another Hekesh. So again, we're going to piggyback one Hekesh on top of the other. And we're going to talk about a Hekesh between Maser Dagon and Maser Behema. Two fundamentally different types of Maser. But nevertheless, once there's a Hekesh between the two, B'Maser Dagon Ksiv B'nai Yisrael. So we go back to this drasha of B'nai Yisrael v'lo ovdei kochavim, and now here's the setup. We have Maser Dagon. From that we have a hekesh to Maser Behema, and from Maser Behema we have a hekesh to Tmura. And the hekesh to Tmura was in the pasuk in Chav Zayin. So now we have a problem. Does the halacha recognize one hekesh that's piggybacked on top of the other? Can you have a halacha that's derived from hekesh? For example, Maser Behema is derived from hekesh to Maser Dagon, that there's no Maser Behema by the 10th animal of a goy. And now we're going to use Maser Behema to teach me that there's no Tmura by a goy because of the hekesh between Maser Behema and Tmura. So the Gemara answers that Maser Dagon Chulinhi. We have sort of like a breakage here, right? It's not A is compared to B, and then B is compared to C, and C is compared to D, and all these, this whole Chadgadya is talking about Kodshim where you can't, derive one hekesh from another hekesh. No. In the middle here, or really not in the middle, the whole takeoff of the whole system here is Maser Dagon. Maser Dagon is not Kodshim. So the Gemara says, "Hanichel man diyomer basar melamed azlinon, avol man diyomer basar lamed azlinon ma'ikol meimar." There's a machlokes about whether or not we can circumvent the problem of ein lomed davar shed behekesh shed lomad hu atzum behekesh. According to this man diyomer, who says it all depends on the melamed, and the melamed here, the one who teaches us the whole din as far as Tmura is concerned, is the Maser Dagon. And the Maser Dagon, we say, is Chulin. So everything's fine. But there's another man who says that when we set up the rules and regulations for one hekesh teaching me, or shall I say, based on the piggyback on another hekesh, it all depends upon the Melamed. I'm sorry, it depends upon the Lamed. Lamed means the one that is derived. So here in this case, we're deriving Maser Behema, which is Kodshim, and from Maser Behema, we're going to derive, dinim of Tmura in the case of a Kodshe Akum. So therefore, now the Gemara has to find another source, an alternative way of justifying that there's no carbon of Maser Behema for a guy. Ela Maser Behema chova she'en kavua zmanhu, v'chova she'en lo zman kavua Yisrael Maise of the Kavlo Maise. So now we introduce another rule that governs Kodshim and differentiates between Kodshim, a carbon of Yisrael, and a carbon of a goy. With regard to Yisrael, there's no difference between a chova that has to be fulfilled and the carbon has to be brought immediately, as opposed to a chova that's ein kavul zman, where he could bring it whenever he wants. But with regard to a guy, a carbon of a guy, the carbon of a guy is limited to a case of let's take Ola, right? The guy accepts upon himself a neder or an nedava. You remember we've discussed the difference between a neder and a nedava, but anyway, he takes upon himself a voluntary obligation to bring a carbon ola, and that's ein kavul zman. Whenever he gets around to it, he'll bring the carbon ola. But then we have something called a chova shekavul zman, and that a guy can't bring. Just 1 second. Okay, forget what I said. I switched it around. A guy cannot bring a carbon chova she'ein kavul zman, which I thought would apply to maser, but forget that. We're going to talk about chatas osham. Just 1 second. So we're looking for a source. Let's just go over this one more time. There's a lot of factors here. We're looking for a source that there's no chiyuv maser behema for a good. Because maser behema is a chova she'ein kavul azman. And apparently what that means is that if the guy voluntarily takes upon himself to bring a chatos or an osham or maser, then he doesn't have to bring this carbon immediately. He says a guy is excluded from bringing an obligatory offering I think we're going back now. I don't want to get too stuck down on this because we'll never finish the daf. But just give me 2 minutes to see if I can clear my head. Just 1 second. Chova maser behema chova she'ein kavul hazman chova she'ein kavul hazman yisrael maisi akum lo maisi. Let's backtrack a little. We said that a guy could bring a carbon ola, right? A voluntary carbon ola, to the exclusion of chatas osham or maser. Because chatas osham v'maser should be classified and defined in terms of Yisrael, because again, a guy can't bring a chatas osham v'maser, as a chova she'en lazman kavua. Right, there's certain karbonos that have to be brought on Yomim Tovim, on Shabbosos. Chatas osham or maser has nothing to do with a moed or a certain particular time, and therefore, whenever a person is chayav a chatas and osham or maser, he can bring and fulfill it at any time that he wants. That's called ein kavul lo zman. Now, a carbon ola, on the other hand, has a zman kavua. So it's a carbon chova, let's say on regel, and a carbon chagiga, which is carbon shlomim, on a regel is obligatory, and it has a kavua lehem zman. So therefore, the guy can volunteer to bring an ola or a shlomim, because for Yisrael, ola and shlomim are categorized as a carbon chova sheish lo zman kavua. So in other words, again, we're using the criterion, the parameter of Yisrael, and we're saying that if the Yisrael has a carbon chova shekavua lo zman, Chatos, Osham, and Maser do not fit that bill because they never have a kavua zman. But if we're talking about an ola or a shlomim, because on Yomim Tovim, again, shlomim in the case of a chagiga, there is a kavua zman, then a guy is included. He can voluntarily accept upon himself that category of a carbon, which for Yisrael would be defined as chova shekavua zman. And the only two karbanos that fit that bill and allow a guy to voluntarily bring those karbanos are ola and shlomim, because ola and shlomim for Yisrael would be a carbon chova sheyesh lem zman kavua. Weiter, ein mevi'in nisachim. Toner Rabbanon, how do we know that a guy cannot bring a voluntary nesach, a niskei yayin that's not connected to a carbon? So the answer is because it says Ezra. Okay, so this is in Bamidbar Perek Tes Vav, in the parsha of Niskei Yayin, that have to accompany an Ol and a Shlom, but the Torah says called Ezrach. And Ezrach means a standing member, a member of our Klal Yisrael. So that's a Yisrael. Ezrach means Chosei Novi Kochav Menichos. But if he brings a carbon ola, which we said that a guy could voluntarily bring a carbon ola, do I say that therefore he doesn't have to bring a carbon nesach niskei yayin together with the old Talmud Lomer kacha? So the word kacha, okay, teaches me that a guy has to bring niskei yayin to accompany his carbon ola. And this pasuk again is in Bamidbar Tes Vav, Kacha Yaseh, etc., etc. Omer Rabbi Yossi, Ro'ani bekulam lahachmir, v'med dvarim amurim. And now we go back to Reb Shimon, who said that there's no me'ila with regard to a carbon of a guy. That's only in Kodshei Mizbech, but not in Kodshei Bedek Habayis. My timer. What's the underlying justification of Rabbi Shimon to make this chiluk between kedushas haguf and kedushas damim? Kasavar ki gamra me'ila chet mitruma. Right, so we have another Gzeir Shava that we didn't speak about today, but we've spoken about it in the past. Maybe we did mention it today. I don't remember. Anyway. Chet mitruma, so me'il is derived from truma. Is dumya the truma? Now, what is truma? Truma is not bedek habayis. It's not kedushas damim. Truma is gufa kodesh. The truma, the kedushas haguf, and then we derive me'ila from kedushas haguf. Just 1 second. In other words, we excluded a carbon of a guy from Me'ila, and that was based on a Gzeir Shava equating Me'ila to Truma. In Truma, we're talking about Kedushas Haguf. We're not talking about Bedek Habayis. So when we go back to the Parsha of Truma, which is the source from which we derive the exclusion of a guy from Tmura, then we're going to talk about excluding the guy from Tmura in a case that's similar to Truma, that's Kedushas Haguf. Well, Kedushas Bedek Habayis, Kedushas Damim, lo. So basically what we come at is that the whole distinction, according to Reb Shimon, between a carbon of a guy and a carbon of a Jew is only relevant to Kedushas Haguf. But as far as Kedushas Bedek Habayis, which is Kedushas Damim, is concerned, there's no difference between a guy and a Jew. Tana Rabbanan, we learned to the Brisa. Dam shenitma uzrako b'shogeg hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. Okay. Now, the dam of the carbon became tummy. So obviously, once the dam is tummy, you can't throw it on the mizbeach. But the Kohen went ahead and he threw it on the mizbeach. And whether or not there's ritzui carbon, meaning it's the carbon kosher, b'di'eved, depends according to this brisa on whether he did so b'shogeg, not realizing that the dam had contracted tumah, and in such a case, hurtza, then the carbon is kosher, and that's going to be based on the tzitz, right? I don't know what he means here in the English translation. He says the offices of the tzitz. I don't know what that means. Offices. I don't know that tzitz has an office. I don't know. Maybe there's another meaning of the word office. I don't know. The tzitz is up here on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol.